all of you. And thank you, Team Ideas, Sunni sir and Veda for having me here again. I'm Ganesh, but not the one for whom the song was being played just before this. I'm a pediatric endocrinologist, so I'll be restricting largely to children and adolescents, but the principles of DKA treatment are more or less similar, whether it is child or whether it is adult. DKA is the most common cause of mortality in type 1 diabetes, especially with short duration of diabetes. Now with improved care in the long duration, cardiovascular or renal causes will predominate. And its incidence varies inversely with the prevalence of type 1 diabetes. So if in the community, if type 1 diabetes is more common, DKA will be less. That's simply because of more awareness. So it's seen in about 15 to 70% cases of new onset type 1 diabetes and about 1 to 10% per patient per year of an established diabetes. And also to note, 6% or 5% cases of youth onset type 2 diabetes, which is much more aggressive disease than an adult onset type 2 diabetes. DKA is much more common in younger children who tend to decompensate very fast. So we also saw in our experience that about 73% of children under 6 had evidence of ketosis or ketoacidosis. This is not just DKA, also ketosis, but it was much more common in younger children. The key thing to be understood about pathophysiology is that there is absolute or severe deficiency of insulin coupled with excess of counter-regulatory hormones, namely glucagon, catecholamines, and steroids, etc., which leads to a cascade of reactions which causes hyperglycemia and hyperosmolality. This is a hyperosmolar kind of dehydration, which subsequently causes loss of water and electrolytes. And the use of alternative fuels instead of glucose, like fatty acids, causes ketogenesis and acidosis, which further compounds the vomiting and dehydration. So as the name suggests, DKA would be diagnosed by diabetic ketoacidosis. So there is hyperglycemia in the form of blood sugars of more than 200, ketonemia as serum ketones more than 3 millimoles or ketonuria, and a venous pH of less than 7.3. And its severity is described as mild, moderate, severe based on the levels of pH and the bicarbonate levels. In some patients who have been partially treated or have had significant restriction of carbohydrates, or in some patients receiving SGLT2 inhibitors, you may not have a very high blood sugar level but may have acidosis. That's termed as euglycemic ketoacidosis. I'm not going to focus on the SGLT2 related ketoacidosis in this talk. How many of you can see this very clearly? This is a scenario which happened in our own emergency where a child came with typical symptoms of DKA, but I got a phone call that child looks like having DKA, but the blood sugar is 81. And we rechecked and it is 81. So please note that especially if your battery of glucometer is wearing off or your eyes are wearing off, you can misinterpret high as 81. So be careful about this. Also, one change that must be brought in our practice, largely, I don't know what is the status here, but where I work, largely we are dependent on urine ketones. Whereas now we have availability of serum ketones, which measure beta-hydroxybutyrate as against acetoacetate in urine ketones, which is a ketone body which rises early, and as we treat, it clears faster. So serum ketones are much more sensitive and specific for diagnosis as well as treatment of DKA to know its resolutions. I've already said that levels more than 3 millimoles are consistent with DKA. Also, another point is that once we open the urine ketone strip bottles, the shelf life is very short. So we have to use it within that much time. If your urine ketone strips are expired, they may give you a false negative result. Let us take help of one case to learn further nuances of the management. So this is a 10-year-old boy who came with excess urination and thirst for 2 weeks. That was his first visit. But by the time he landed in emergency with respiratory distress, he had already had 3 points of contact with the treating doctor, where they were multiple times reassured that, okay, it is healthy to drink water, or there is winter season, that's why child must be passing more urine, or he might be having some problem, give him some juices or some liquids to energize him more. How often do you see in your practice? How often, can you raise your hands if you see this commonly in your practice? So this is, till date also, it's very common. So by simply diagnosing type 1 diabetes well in time, in a child who is having classic symptoms, nothing unusual. I mean, even if we focus on those with classic symptoms, or those who are working in emergency room, think of DKA as a differential in acute abdomen or persistent vomiting or altered sensorium or respiratory distress. Many of the cases would be diagnosed and treated in time, much before complications set in. And in a known case of type 1 diabetes, the single most important thing to prevent decay is not to miss insulin. Even if you have infections or anything, if you take insulin, you are unlikely to go in DKA. Now, coming back to the child, this child is in emergency and we've been called for assessment. So as we go, we take a brief history and do a rapid cardiopulmonary assessment. Now, the assessment, investigations, and management can go hand in hand, but for the sake of description, I'm describing them one step at a time. In the assessment, it is important to ask how much fluids were received before the child came to your hospital, because child might have been seen somewhere else where they may have received fluids. And also, oral fluids are also important, especially if the child has had a lot of Glucon-D or juices or something like that before coming to you. Assess the clinical severity of dehydration, but please remember that this is not a dehydration of diarrhea. This is a dehydration of decay where what you see, the dehydration is more than that, because the intravascular compartment is maintained for a long period of time. The glucose is going to attract a lot of water inside the blood vessels, and therefore you will see the signs of dehydration. The actual dehydration is out of proportion to the clinical signs. If you see hypotension, oliguria, and impalpable pulses, that suggests severe dehydration, about 10%. And it is also important to weigh the child at that time. Often in the hurry of doing everything, we forget to weigh the child, because all the calculations are based on that particular weight and not the weight 15 days back or 1 month ago. These are the usual investigations that we do. We put a wide bore IV cannula, peripheral IV cannula, to obtain blood and urine samples to confirm the diagnosis, to see the level of dehydration with the help of the renal function tests, hemogram. We also do calcium phosphate, amylase, and lipase in the first prick. And for those where the electrolyte results are not immediately available, an ECG is an important asset to look for changes of hyperkalemia, or sometimes rarely hypokalemia also. We investigate for infection if there is history of fever or any other focus of infection. Now, remember that an arterial blood gas is not necessary to make a diagnosis of decay. So therefore, don't waste your time finding radial artery and pricking the child and giving him more pain. A venous blood gas is good enough. There is no need to do an arterial blood gas. So these are the results of initial assessment in this particular child. And these are on the right side of you are the lab results. Now, it is important to do a lab blood sugar at diagnosis, because often the glucometer shows HI and the actual blood sugar can be 1300 or 1200 or something like that. You need to know that, because you need to see how it is going to drop further. Also, while interpreting the sodium levels, please remember that this compartment is having a lot of glucose and water in it. So therefore, the sodium that you see is less than what it is actually. So you need to correct the sodium for the hyperglycemia, which you would do by using this formula, where you subtract 100 from the plasma glucose, divide it by 100, multiply by 2, and add the measured sodium to that. So that gives you a corrected sodium. So as you treat, the gap between corrected sodium and the measured sodium is going to decline. And that's an important sign to be monitored, because where it doesn't go away, that child is at more risk of getting cerebral edema. The counts may be high, but that does not suggest infection per se. On the other hand, if there is fever, fever is not a symptom of diabetic ketoacidosis. So if there is fever, you need to investigate for that. High lipase and amylase do not mean pancreatitis. So high lipase and amylase can be seen in DKA. At the same time, a rare complication of DKA is also pancreatitis. So we need to assess this very carefully. Coming to the treatment part, we do the supportive treatment like airway and oxygen like any other case. It's very important. One important lesson that I learned is that it is important to put Ryle's tube even in a conscious child if there is a history of recent intake of consuming a lot of sweet liquids. This is because there might be initially a gastroparesis, and as you treat, this ingested glucose is going to be absorbed and going to give you a rebound hyperglycemia. So to prevent that, it's important to remove that, so particularly if there is a recent history of having a lot of liquids, sweet liquids. Obtain 2 peripheral IV cannula. I'll tell you the reason why. And avoid central lines, particularly femoral lines, as far as possible. But I know that sometimes it may not be totally avoidable. In that case, a jugular line is preferable to femoral line, because DKA is a prothrombotic state, and there is a high risk of deep vein thrombosis. Antibiotics and bladder catheterization if the patient is unable to void on command. Now, when we say decay, the first thing that comes to our mind in terms of treatment is insulin and bicarb. But that is not the first thing that is important. The most important thing is to give fluids. So the first and most important thing that we are going to give is to give fluid, that too, isotonic fluid like normal saline. So we give 10 ml per kg of normal saline over 60 minutes. If perfusion is very poor, then it could be over 30 minutes. If the child is in shock, then it needs a resuscitative fluid like 20 ml per kg of boluses. Subsequently, now the recent ISPAD guidelines have made it very, very flexible. So subsequently, the fluid needs to be corrected as deficit plus maintenance. I mean, even it doesn't say minus the fluids received prior to the hospital visit, so it gives a lot of flexibility. But this is what I have been doing, that I still subtract the fluids that were given prior to the hospital visit, and plan the correction over 24 to 48 hours as a uniform correction. So we prefer 48 hours, especially in younger children and those with severe decay. The tonicity of the fluid needs to be between half to full or full strength normal saline, 0.45 to 0.9% saline, depending on the initial sodium and osmolality, and do not forget to add potassium. When the blood glucose falls below the levels of 250 milligram per deciliter, the fluid needs to change to dextrose-containing fluid. So it will be dextrose half normal saline or dextrose normal saline. Whenever you change the pint, remind the sister to add potassium again. Urinary losses are not routinely added to the IV fluids, but in a rare situation that might be needed. Now this kind of fluid approach is based on the recent study in NEJM called as PECAN study, which was a multi-center randomized controlled trial with almost 1,400 episodes of decay, where they gave 4 kinds of fluids, half or 0.45 and 0.9 saline, fast and slow. And they found out that neither the rate of administration nor the sodium chloride content of intravenous fluids significantly influenced neurological outcomes in children with decay. But please, please, please remember that most of the children that were included in this study had mild decay. So therefore, the conclusions of this study apply to those with mild or at best moderate decay and not to severe diabetic ketoacidosis. For those who are very lazy to calculate, ISPAD has given a ready-made table in their guidelines where you can just see the weight and just see the fluid rate. You can just keep this in your emergency sheet. This is only the half of the table because I couldn't fit in the whole thing in this particular slide. It is there in the ISPAD diabetic ketoacidosis guidelines. With regards to insulin treatment, the most important thing to remember is do not give a bolus dose of insulin before you start the insulin infusion. This is not only useless, I mean, it can cause significant drop in osmolality, leading to increased risk of cerebral edema and also increase the risk of hypokalemia. Therefore, directly start with insulin infusion, that too after 1 hour of giving IV fluids, as 0.05 to 0.1 unit per kg per hour as a continuous infusion in a dedicated peripheral IV line. That is the purpose of putting 2 IV lines, because the insulin needs to go through a dedicated peripheral line, not central, because central line has lots of thousands of other things going in and the insulin delivery will not be proper. And it has to be continued. When the sister calls you that the sugar is 120, don't reflexively say that stop insulin. No, don't do that. If the ketoacidosis hasn't reversed, insulin infusion has to be continued. You increase the dextrose concentration of the IV fluids from 5 to 10% to 12%, but do not reduce insulin if the acidosis hasn't reversed. If acidosis is reversing, yes, you can go down a bit, but do not stop altogether till you are completely at home. The desired fall is about 50 to 90 or 40 to 90 milligram per deciliter per hour. Now, this low-dose insulin infusion is the newer thing. Previously, everybody used to get 0.1 unit per kg per hour, but there are few articles. One of this is a study from PGI Chandigarh, which randomized 25 children to low-dose and to conventional dose of insulin. And they found that low-dose infusion was non-inferior to standard dose with respect to control of hyperglycemia and time to resolution of acidosis. However, in the adolescents and older children, we are still continuing with the practice of giving conventional dose, but in younger children, we give 0.05 unit per kg per hour. There are few studies with subcutaneous insulin in mild decay. Remember, it is mild decay. If it is moderate or severe decay, don't even play with the subcutaneous insulin. I have no experience in managing insulin subcutaneous insulin, decay with a subcutaneous insulin regimen. But there are a couple of studies which have used that. Potassium depletion is significant in people with decay, so therefore potassium replacement is very, very important, because as soon as you replace the fluid and insulin, the potassium levels are going to drop significantly in the serum. So if there is hypokalemia, you start right away, But if there is, if the potassium is high, usually it tends to be high at the time of diagnosis. At that point of time, you wait once the urine output is confirmed, that time you start. Ideally, half the replacement as KCl and half as K-phosphate, but if K-phosphate is not available, often we have to give full replacement as KCl. Start with 40 milliequivalent per liter, add to the IV fluids. If the potassium is low, you can increase it up to 60 or 80 milliequivalent per liter also, and rarely we might even have to give a infusion of potassium that has to be under supervision of an intensivist. And sometimes if the hypokalemia is persistent, then we might have to temporarily withhold the insulin infusion for half an hour or 1 hour till the potassium is normal. Now, if I ask correction of acidosis, many of the people might reflexly think of bicarb, but bicarb is not the treatment for correction of acidosis in DK. It is the fluids and insulin. The DK acidosis gets corrected with fluid and insulin in most cases. So bicarbonate is required only if there is a myocardial dysfunction due to acidosis, and that too it is not necessarily to correct it to totally normal levels. A safe level of 10 or 12 milliequivalent is also fine, because it can cause significant hyperosmolality, hypernatremia, hypokalemia, and paradoxical CNS acidosis, because the carbon dioxide that is going to be released as the bicarbonate reaction is going to diffuse into the brain and get converted into acid. So thinking of these, we gave the treatment as 300 ml of normal saline in the first hour, subsequently planned correction over 48 hours, 48-hour maintenance plus 7% deficit minus the fluids given comes to around 100 ml per hour. And insulin infusion was given, and potassium and bicarbonate was not given in this case. It is important to have a structured follow-up sheet or flow sheet for managing any child with DK, which mentions vital signs, laboratory parameters. So often the blood glucose, capillary blood glucose is checked hourly. In the initial period, the electrolytes or blood gas might need to be checked every 2 to 4 hourly, but subsequently you can, based on your clinical judgment, you can decrease the frequency. Also keep a tab of insulin rates and the kind of fluids that are going. So let us say that we have treated very nicely, but after 6 hours of treatment, we are still, struggling with the control of acidosis. So what if your child has persistent acidosis despite of giving us what you think have done correctly, what could have gone wrong? There could be reasons related to insulin effect. So maybe the infusion is not going in a dedicated line, or you might need to prepare a fresh infusion. Inadequate fluids, sometimes there is lactic acidosis, septicemia, renal impairment. A common cause when the patient is improving but the blood gas is not improving is a hyperchloremic acidosis, where when the DK is healing, the kidney is going to preferentially excrete the ketones in place of the chloride. So therefore, there is, in addition to that, if you are giving a lot of sodium chloride and KCl, there's going to be some hyperchloremia. So therefore, that just requires modification of the IV fluids. If you're giving normal saline, we can reduce it to half normal saline. And if you're giving full KCl, we might make it half KCl, half K-phosphate. And usually it tends to get better with time. Now, this boy, after 12 hours, suddenly becomes agitated, starts shouting, abusive, starts pulling out his clothes, IV lines, etc., and there is tachycardia. What do you think is happening? What do you think is happening? Most children with DK die of cerebral edema. Therefore, cerebral edema is most important complication to be thought and suspected early. So the moment this happens, changes in sensorium, headache, changes in the vital parameters, any specific neurological signs, Cushing's triad, which is described in books but is less common, but it's quite specific, or decreased oxygen saturation, think of cerebral edema. And treat early. Don't wait for MRI or CT scan to do confirmation of diagnosis of cerebral edema. Initiate treatment early, reduce the fluid rate, give mannitol. Mannitol should be there by bedside. It might be needed anytime, and it works like magic. So after mannitol, suddenly within 15 to 20 minutes, the same guy who was shouting is quiet and in a kind of meditative mode. So in case mannitol doesn't work, there is option of either repeating the dose of mannitol or giving a hypotonic saline. If nothing works, then we might have to hyperventilate, but usually hyperventilation carries a poor prognosis with respect to neurological outcomes. As I said, that imaging is not necessary for diagnosis of cerebral edema, but might be important to rule out other conditions like meningitis or vascular thrombosis. In DKA, other than cerebral edema, there can be a host of other complications. And all of these can happen. It is not that just because it is written in books, rare, but please be watchful for common ones like electrolyte abnormalities, rare ones like central venous thrombosis, rhabdomyolysis, pancreatitis, acute kidney shutdown, or hypophosphatemia. So this is one girl whom we managed in SGPGI when she was like 13-year-old in 2008. She presented with ARDS, and this girl taught me never to lose hope in DKA. Whatever may be the bicarb, whatever may be the pH, don't lose hope. She was dying. We were writing a death certificate for her, and me and my anesthetic colleague just said that just keep her on maximum inotrope and everything and just continue, and she survived. And since then till now, every Holi Diwali, I get a phone call from her thanking me for just keeping a hope. Also, another important thing which in India particularly we mustn't forget, girl recovering from DKA, coming with bloody nasal discharge, the next day pouring pus from her eyes, and the third day having an abscess in the brain. Boy developing a small pustule on hand after recovery of DKA, which rapidly spread, became gangrenous and had to be amputated. Boy who recovered from DKA presented with abdominal distension, constipation, and significant intestinal necrosis needing removal of 90 centimeters of his intestine, which subsequently also made an aneurysm in the iliac artery and bled in the kidney, leading to 1 liter of blood loss. What are you thinking? Don't forget mucormycosis. Always remember that any evidence of any small vessel or medium vessel thrombosis in DKA, anywhere else, not just rhinocerebral. Before these other cases, I used to think that it's only rhinocerebral. But it can happen in skin, it can happen in intestine, lungs, it can happen in many places. So don't forget mucormycosis. After you have treated DKA, there is time to switch to subcutaneous insulin. So we say that the DKA treatment is successful if pH is more than 7.3 and bicarbonate is more than 15, and the child is able to tolerate oral intake. Now, switching happens just before meals, and there's no concept of giving regular insulin every 4 hourly and then deciding how much dose the child is going to need. Whatever regimen you have decided, you can directly switch over. Start with the basal bolus insulin right from day one itself, and give. If we are giving rapid-acting insulin, give 15 minutes before meals, and regular insulin 30 minutes before meals. Let the child have meal, and 15 to 30 minutes after the child has had meals, that is the time to stop infusion, because you are giving that much time for the subcutaneous insulin to be in the blood circulation of the child. Administer basal insulin preferably before stopping the insulin infusion itself. You can administer it few hours before the infusion also. There are now studies which have continued glargine in a small dose during the DKA management also, and have shown quite reasonably good results, particularly in a child who has known type 1 diabetes. And monitor the blood glucose to titrate the insulin dose. No management of DKA is complete if we leave the child without telling them how to prevent DKA subsequent episodes. So all of them have to have written guidelines. This is a simple SPAD Life for a Child handout in one page, which explains very nicely how sick day management needs to be done. And remember a simple mnemonic of SICK, that is sugar, insulin, carbs, and ketones. Check sugars frequently. Do not forget insulin. You might need extra insulin for the hyperglycemia. Take carbs regularly and check ketones regularly. And you have to tell them when to visit the hospital also. So to conclude, DKA is the most common cause of mortality with type 1 diabetes duration of less than 10 years. And timely diagnosis can prevent most episodes of DKA, which is a very, very terrible complication. It has long-term implications also. Those children who present with DKA tend to have long-term neurological problems. I've told you the principles of management. It's important to recognize cerebral edema as well as other complications and educate the family on preventing subsequent episodes of DKA. Thank you so much.
Very